Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Overseas Famous podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Owens. Today we are joined, it's one of my favorite episodes because we're joined by guys that I really respect and look up to, Paul Shirley, Sean McCaw. These two, both basketball players, professional basketball players who ended up writing books. And this is what our show is going to be about. This is an author episode. We're going to talk with authors. We're going to talk about how it came to be. How do you go from being a basketball player to an author? And just all the crazy stories that go with this. So guys, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. We're gonna probably gonna walk and step all over each other's paragraphs here. So get ready for that, everybody.
It's funny because we've been doing more group episodes, and that's like the biggest thing. I know there's multiple times where even when we do a group with our team, my producer will jump all over each other and be like, so what do you, and like two people are asking questions. They're like, so I'm not really sure where it's coming from. But what kind of
I'll give you first dibs.
Okay. Thank you. It's kind of you to respect your elders, I assume.
So Paul, we will get started with you because you're, if we're going into old school terminology, you're like the godfather of authoring a book when everyone knows the stories of the main guys. Everyone has the stories, the Birds, the Jordans, the Magics. You were really the first guy to in the mainstream tell your story of, hey, I played in the NBA. I was a very good player, great college player at Iowa State, did a lot of great things in professional basketball, but no one's writing stories about me because that's always what we end up being, kind of like that end of the bench, kind of towards the middle of the bench guy. And you were the first one to really write that story and tell people these stories that, hey, there's a whole lot of other guys out here that are doing the same thing. So what was your process of going through this writing career where you kind of started taking us into your journey as an athlete?
Well, you mentioned the trials and tribulations of the minor leagues and playing overseas and how that's contrasted with being in the NBA. And I think I was actually, when it comes to writing a book, really fortunate that I had all of those experiences that weren't particularly glamorous, because that's where the stories come from, right? So when my book was getting close to done, that first book was a big Random House book. I had a fancy pants editor in New York City who I became very close with. I remember him saying that when he bought the book, he thought it was going to be about the NBA, but that over time he was realizing that the funny and the best stories came because of those long jury nights on a bus between Sioux Falls and Bismarck, or not getting paid in Greece. Like that's where the really interesting, meaty stuff comes. So in a lot of ways, I think it was easier to write a book because I had such a tumultuous career. If it had just been Paul Shirley's a McDonald's All-American, he gets drafted number 8 by the X team and goes on to a 10-year career that's kind of marginal, that book isn't particularly interesting, right? Like like you said, we sort of know what that story is. I think because I had so many things thrown at me really quickly, it made for better stories, as I mentioned, but it also made me want to understand what had happened to me, which was part of why I started writing in the first place. There were so many strange things going on, not strange like Stranger Things sorts of strange, but just unfamiliar to me. Nobody in my family had ever even played college basketball or college sports at all, let alone professionally. So I was getting all of this for the first time. I had never left the US even before going to Greece to play for a team there. And I think the fact that I was such a neophyte meant that I was sponge-like when it came to just absorbing all of this. Whereas if somebody had come from a long family, if you were one of the Walton kids, right? Like maybe those things wouldn't be as interesting to you because you had already sort of expected them. So I think I was in a lot of ways just transcribing the bizarre nature of what it's like to be a journeyman athlete, whether it's basketball, baseball, or anything else.
Yeah, It is such a unique thing. And I think we all probably experience this because the same thing, the best stories that I have of everyone asking, like, you're stopped all the time because we're all tall human beings. So I think that was like my inspiration behind my book. I was like, every time I went anywhere, someone would stop me and it would be a 20-minute conversation. And I'd tell them stories and they would seem fascinated and interested in what I was saying. So I was like, I mean, not for nothing, but I don't feel like wasting 20 minutes at Home Depot. Why don't I put a book out and you can buy it and actually start putting something, putting this into something that's actually profitable. But you're right. The worst stories that we suffered through ended up being the most interesting stories for people to hear. And it's funny how that works out. And I know, Sean, with your book, you did a good job of giving people the overseas life, like what to expect. It's almost like the what to expect when you're expecting, like, guide to being an overseas basketball player. And I thought that was a fascinating approach too. You're going into all of the same things, but it's like, hey, this is what you need to look out for. This happens, you need to go and react here. And I thought that was really interesting too.
Thank you. I think one of my motivations was something like what Paul just said, that not a lot of guys have these family lines or friends that played overseas. So how do you get that information from someone who's never been there, So that was part of my motivation, was to get the information out there for people that have never been over here, what to expect, and especially for young guys, because for those guys, they're not going to be making a whole lot of money. And I mean, if you're playing on a EuroLeague team, if you're just played in the NBA and you've got an offer to a team in Olympiakos in Greece, you're playing EuroLeague. You've got a team behind you. You've got people that are handling your finances. You're handling your workouts and things like that. But if you're a guy that's coming over to Europe and making what, $800-900 a month or less, or the average guy is probably making around $5,000 a month. Yeah, you don't have a team behind you. So that was part of my motivation to really help guys and women as well, and let them know what to expect when they first come over here, because that first year is pivotal.
It really is. That first year was the most difficult. Everyone I feel like as an overseas guy, you always are kind of the underdog. It's either the underdog or you're, Paul, you had mentioned almost like the overdog, where the story of the guy who was a high draft pick. I know multiple guys who were high draft picks and then ended up in the NBA and not really the career that they wanted, and then they headed overseas. So you're either an underdog or an overdog, and it's such a different mindset going into there. So I think your book is so perfect for guys to just be able to say, hey, this is what you're going to deal with. And there's so many. I mean, we all wrote stories about not getting paid, about not being, how you're treated, how the fans are. I mean, the crazy fans. I know, Paul, and it's, first off, Paul, it's really funny to hear, live your voice. And I've listening to your audiobook, like, I'm a big audiobook. So I drove to Pennsylvania when I was kind of finishing up my book. I drove to Pennsylvania and I listened to it the entire way. And then it was so inspirational that on the way back, I listened to it again. So like hearing your voice, it's like fun. And I'm actually going to record my audiobook. And the one thing I was like, my voice sounds like shit. Like, you have a nice mellow voice. Like, my voice is real, like Ray Romano-ish. And I'm like, is anyone going to listen to this for, like 5 hours of just me talking?
Well, if it's any consolation, I also hate hearing my own voice. So I think that's a universal truth about all of us, especially ad nauseum, right? When you're like, okay, we got it, man. That's enough. That's how I feel about every podcast or audiobook or snippet that I do.
So, Paul, your story is really unique in terms of how you became a writer. You were still kind of telling those stories. You get, Bill Simmons is interested in what you're doing, kind of picks you up, and then you kind of take off with this writing career. And was that difficult because you were growing as a writer, but you were still playing at the time? Was that difficult to kind of maintain both avenues, knowing that this is eventually what you wanted to get into?
it was difficult in that I was learning in the public eye in a way. That's not to say that I was writing for the New York Times, but I was developing as a writer in a really public way. I've worked with writers for the last 6 or 7 years, and in some ways I'm envious that many of them get to develop a voice kind of on their own, and I was doing that for all to see, which I think had its downsides in that I didn't know what I was doing and was making it up as I was going. But it had the upside of it honed me more quickly, right? So I was learning what worked and what didn't as I was doing it. I had started all this when I first went over to Greece, actually. The year before, when I was a senior at Iowa State, a friend of a friend had gone to play in Spain, I think the second division in Spain. He was writing these email updates that I thought were really funny about all of what he was going through. And I resolved that if I got to play professionally, I would do something similar. I had never been really any kind of a writer. You know, I'm around writers now who are like, well, yeah, I've dreamed of being a novelist since I was 7. And I'm like, I read a lot, but it never occurred to me that I could write something. So anyway, I get to Greece, and, you know, as we've all sort of already discussed, so many odd things were happening that I didn't have any shortage of material. I didn't want for material. So I just started each week sitting down and writing a little journal entry that I would send out at first to, 15 or 20 people. I quickly realized that if I made them funny, people would respond to my emails and I would feel less alone, which was a big boon, as you guys can recall from being overseas, where you feel often like you're in the actual movie, The Martian. And so, like, as I built that shtick, people started asking, like, hey, could you add so-and-so to this list? And then it became something that I felt obligated to do in a really positive way. It was like I had a built-in kind of critique group. If I wrote something that really resonated, I would get, 10, 12, 15 emails. If it was kind of a dud, I'd get 2 emails. And so I think that trained me in a lot of ways. And that continued for the next 4 years. I just kept doing that. Then when the Phoenix Suns came to me and asked, would you write a, quote, blog? I say quote because at the time it was newfangled, right? It was 2005. People didn't really know what blogs were. I had already built up kind of a persona, I guess, as this guy who was navigating a strange world. And I would love to say modestly or with humility that it came as a surprise when it was successful. But I remember when they asked me, I thought, this is your chance. Like, I'd always thought I would write a book when my career was done, but I had this feeling like, I think people will be into this if I'm able to maintain my voice, which it was a little bit sort of, I don't know, I didn't say exactly what the team expected me to say. They want you to say, like, well, we're gearing up to play the Pacers today. We just hope we'll go out there and execute and play hard. And I was writing about, like, how I'd forgotten what hotel room I was in because we've been on the road so long. And so I had this sense, like, if I do this right, people will probably pay attention. And so again, I wish I could say with all humility that I was stunned when it took off, but I kind of was like, yeah, this stuff is good. Like, people will be interested in this. But that came because I'd been doing it for 4 years already. It wasn't like I just picked it up one day and was like, oh yeah, I know how to be sarcastic in a piece of writing.
When you guys were blogging, did you guys have any players come up to you and discuss the blogs with you?
Sean, I've talked for too long.
Actually, I just started blogging pretty much after I wrote the book. I've always been interested in writing, but I never thought to do it for myself until after I started the process of writing the book for the second time. I wrote it about 14 years ago, actually. And I was horrible. I was terrible. The book was terrible. And I couldn't find an agent, a literary agent, or anyone to publish it. So I threw it away. And I didn't throw it away, but it was pretty much in my cellar for the last 12, 13 years. I would kind of copy it and pass it out to people if they asked for it or knew someone that might need the information in there. But it wasn't until 2020 when I had more time due to Corona that my best friend told me, hey, dust it off and redo it. And that's what I did. And that was the process for me. So until now, I haven't really had anybody in my blogs that I do on my website that has come to me. But I've had quite a few people that have contributed to the book and told their stories, and I think I'll do another one and have some more.
I think it's so interesting. And Matt, kind of what you said, I know when my last year when I was in Estonia, I had been blogging because I started a blog called Waiting for Godunk. And it was kind of a spinoff of the name Waiting for Godot, where like you're waiting, and I had gotten hurt, and then just the jobs dried up. So I was waiting to go play, and I eventually went and played in Kosovo. And then I was back to waiting again the following year because I just wasn't the same player. And I ended up playing in Estonia. And I think, and I don't have any evidence for this, but I'm pretty sure that the only reason that I got that job was because they liked my blog, and they're like, this could get recognition for the Estonian Basketball League.
It's funny that you say that, Kevin, because when I signed the book deal, I had just finished the season with the Phoenix Suns, where Suns were best record in the NBA. Steve Nash and Marty Stoudemire, we went to the Western Conference Finals, right? And I didn't play, but garbage time, and if that, right? Previous to that, though, like when I played for the Bulls and in my time with the Hawks, I wasn't necessarily a 12th man. I was, on bad teams, I could be your 8th or 9th guy. So I was still thinking like my career will go forward from this. And I vividly remember thinking that if you were going to hire a guy to be your 10th, 11th, 12th guy, why not hire me? Because I would bring the following of like the extremely online dudes in your city. Like that's not a huge population, but it, like you're saying, I actively thought this might actually help me, that it would be a selling point because the NBA might embrace kind of the new media of all of it. And I was very wrong. Like my agent told me, like after that book deal happened, he's like, you're not going to play in the NBA again, which is not like, the world wasn't shorted Paul Shirley's NBA talents by this. It's just that they looked at it like it's a risk. This guy's just a little bit too much of a risk. And if he were, if he were Jermaine O'Neal, it might be worth taking that risk, but it's Paul Shirley. And the best case scenario is he averages 6 points a game. So it's just not even worth it.
Let me jump on that.
Go ahead, Sean.
I think we all know how like the secrecy of locker room talk and things like that go on. And so what's spoken in the locker room stays in the locker room. I can imagine a lot of GMs, after you signed your book deal, were afraid that you would talk or that you would write about the secrecy or the things that went on in locker rooms. And of course, we all know that there's some crazy stuff that go on in locker rooms. And if you've got a book deal, you're basically a beat writer inside of a locker room. So I can imagine that was a huge factor in you not getting picked up.
Yeah, no, it was an error by me. I did manage. So after the book came out, I played for another 4 or 5 years, and did go to training camp with the Minnesota Timberwolves, but got cut by them. And then it became clear too that for me the right level was to be playing in Spain. Right. So the Spanish ACB was like the perfect level for me. And I think that, we all here, I think, went through this progression of assuming that the NBA was the answer. Yeah. Also probably playing at levels that were slightly beneath us, and then eventually leveling out and figure out like, oh, this is where I'm both challenged, but I'm also capable. And so I'm actually not particularly sour grapesy about the fact that I didn't go on to continue to play in the NBA, because I'm so grateful that I got to sort of find my space in Spain.
Yeah, that is very true. I do think that you don't know. It's like this part just too hot, this part just too cold, and then you kind of find that sweet spot and you're like, okay, I can do this here. I feel like I did that when I got to Australia. I was like, wow, this is really a good situation and good people. And it was just where I felt like most comfortable. And I feel like we always talk about the more confident you are, the better happier you are off the court, the better you're going to play on the court. If you're miserable in a place, it's going to transition the game. And I think that it's so big that you're able to have those happy times and be able to, balance that with on the court.
Mhm. Sean, how do you, so I see, so you coach now, right?
No, actually, I'm a teacher now.
Oh, okay.
I played. By the way, I'm older than you.
I just did some research, and it speaks to how youthful you look, that you just
Thank you,
appear
thank
to
you.
be much younger than I am, or it speaks to how aged I look, that the opposite.
No, I've stopped coaching. I'm a teacher now for the last 6 years, and so I had my 13-year run in Europe in six
Mhm.
different countries, and then I coached for another 9 years or so. And like you guys were talking about, I felt comfortable here in Germany, and that's why I stayed. I've been now in Germany for, I don't know, a long time,
Mhm.
and so I felt comfortable here, and that's why I've stayed here. So I'm not coaching anymore, but I'm still connected to the game in various ways.
Well, I guess what I was going to ask you is, when you were coaching, how did your experience as being maybe a fish out of water American then get put into practice when it came to trying to make guys feel comfortable? Like Kevin was talking about that comfort level.
Right.
Did you think overtly about that, of like, how do I make this guy feel like he's going to fit in really quickly?
No doubt, because when I first came over here, I came over in 1995. And I mean, compared to now, that was like the stone age of European basketball.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of training things that were really bad back then that I experienced. And so as I got older and then went right into coaching, I tried to make sure that my players felt comfortable, because I know how it was being alone. And luckily, when I first came over, I had two teammates that were Americans, and they helped out a lot. But a lot of guys don't have that. They don't have that support system. So for me, it was also really important to connect with the American players that I had, or foreign players in general, and make sure that they were taken care of. Also on a mental aspect, because you guys know, being away from your family for a long time, that can wear on you. And if those guys are feeling bad because they're homesick, they're not doing me very well as a coach.
Right.
So that was definitely a part of my strategy to connect with my American players, and I think I did a pretty good job of that.
Mhm.
So we're talking with Paul Shirley. This is what I was taught. I'm terrible at podcasting. I've been doing it for a long time, but it's one of those things where I just, as a host, like, I'm good on the side. So learning how to be a host is definitely weird. So then I get like, text, like, make sure you're constantly telling everyone who's on. So Paul Shirley, this is the author's episode. Paul Shirley, author of the book, multiple books, and I want to talk about that one next. But author of the book, Can I Keep My Jersey, which is like the greatest cover, and also like the greatest. It's the question that you're always asking, because I have a closet full of my jerseys. I know Sean has them behind him. It is something that you're always wondering, like, can I keep my jersey? Also, incredible book, stories I tell on dates, which I love, like how it's put together, how it's written, even the start of the date and then the story. It's just perfect. And then Ball Boy, which we're going to talk about in a second. Also, Sean McCaw. Sean McCaw, author of the book, same name, different game, Your Guide to a Successful Overseas Career. Again, a lot of these books that we've written are all nonfiction. They're all exactly what our careers were. They're telling Sean telling people this is what you're going to expect. A lot of us telling the stories of what's going on. Now, Ball Boy is your first crack at fiction. How difficult was that to make that transition? Because I think I don't know how to write unless I'm writing about myself. I know that sounds horrifyingly selfish, but I don't really know how to do it. But the fiction, I always wondered how difficult that was to kind of figure that one out.
Well, it speaks to how difficult it is that it actually wasn't my first crack at it. That was my third crack at writing fiction. I started writing a novel when I was in Spain, that I wrote 60,000 words of, sent to my agent thinking I was, on to something. And he's like, this is a really great character study that would then lead to you writing an actual plot. And then, so I threw that away, then worked on another novel for several years, 3 or 4 years, that was kind of loosely based on my own life, which, if you ever want to write fiction, tip number one is do not base it on your own life, because it is really difficult to get into a voice of fiction if it's too close to your own existence, at least in my experience. And then Ball Boy came about because somebody said, and Kevin, you mentioned that you've heard my voice a bunch because of the audiobook of Stories I Tell on Dates. So I don't write or speak in a particularly complicated way. I tend to use fairly small words, and I go by the old Winston Churchill adage of like, smart people use simple words to explain complicated things, right? And so somebody, when she was reading my fiction, was like, have you ever thought about writing young adult fiction? Because you write in such a simple way, which was kind of an insult, right? Like, you're sort of an idiot. But I internalized that, and then ended up thinking or considering this novel about a kid in sort of a reverse Karate Kid situation where he moves from California to small town Kansas. And then as it grew, it became a little less YA or young adult and more a story that happened to be about a 14-year-old. And it took a lot of work, and it's not nearly as good as some of my novelist heroes, but I did learn a lot from that experience. It helped that I was in Los Angeles and I was around writers all the time, and I was thinking about screenwriting and how that works. I got to turn my first book into a TV pilot with Fox in the middle of my career, and got to see kind of that. I think television and movies inform the way we think about fiction. So being in that world, I think, helped me to think about how to write fiction. I'm working on another novel now, which is it's not basketball related at all. Nobody's going to care when it comes out, but I really love the exercise of writing fiction because it's so difficult and complicated. And I think, like we're talking about with basketball, when you find a level where you're really challenged, it's very engaging. And that's how I feel about writing novels. It's so complicated, but it means that you have to be completely hooked up at all times, just like when we were all on the court, when you feel that sense of like, I cannot lose focus for even an instant, or somebody's going to get past me, or I'm going to screw something up. So I think I love it the most because it's so difficult.
Now, when you guys were writing your books, did you guys ever experience any writer's block? I know authors often experience a writer's block.
Kevin, what about you? You're fresh off this.
Yeah, definitely had a lot of times where I know, Paul, you talk a lot about setting aside that time. And towards the end of my book, I remember following a lot of your advice and sitting. And some of those sessions, it would be frustrating because I would try to set aside that time, and I'd just sit there and I'd be like, so distracted. And I'd be like, I have nothing to give here. And I'd start typing, and then I'd be like, the next morning I'd look at it and be like, this all sucks. And same thing, I'd get rid of it all. So I definitely struggled with a lot of that. I felt like the one thing that was the hardest, I think the most writer's block I dealt with was when the book was done according to me. And then I sent it to my editor, and it
wasn't done.
Yeah, it wasn't done. And she came back and she's like, hold up, like, you need to fix this, you need to fix this. And when I kind of did that, I remember thinking, like, shit, that is my struggle as a writer. I can start a story and finish it, but if I have to jump in from the middle, that's where I find it the most difficult, to jump in from the middle of a story and then figure out how I'm going to manipulate this to make it into here, and how am I going to transition this to that. That was my biggest struggle as a writer. And I definitely experienced writer's block when she sent it back. And maybe it was the confidence too. You're like, shit, like I thought it was done, like, or not done, but I thought there would be a lot less work. And then coming out and it's like, wow, there's a whole lot more that I have to do. And that almost kind of like dropped the confidence. Like, you're thinking you're up here, and then you turn out down here, and it's like, okay, a lot of work to do. And that was a struggle, because what you thought was done is now being refreshed, and you're starting again from the middle. And then it's hard to kind of get that motivation at times to be like, all right, like, is she going to just return this? Like, what's happening next? And that was the toughest thing I dealt with.
I think for me, what haunted me was my own expectations of myself and some level of
Yes.
perfectionism. So the times when I would find myself being, quote, blocked, usually it came back to I had been praised for writing something and now thought that I needed to come out of the proverbial gate writing something great. When I allowed myself to just write like me, or as I often say to writers that I work with, just write it badly, I tended to not be faced with so much writer's block because I could allow myself a ramp in, much like, and this actually kind of comes back to basketball, in that when you go to work out in the summer, you're not going to do your warm up in front of 15,000 people. You're just going to stroll out there and like get the muscles going, and that's okay. And you're going to miss some shots and it's going to be ugly. And so it has really helped me to understand or to set up rules for myself where no one ever is going to see my first draft. And that gives me a lot of freedom, and in a lot of ways takes away that writer's block, because it's like me rolling into the gym at 9 o'clock in Kansas City after, when I was 30 years old and I didn't really feel like doing it. But then, you start moving around, you're like, all right, well, yeah, okay, this will come back to me. And when I allow myself into that mentality as a writer, I think I do a lot better.
I never had writer's block with this book. Well, my first book. I'm now writing my second. I think with the first book, I didn't have any writer's block because I was so connected to the theme, and I was still playing when I first started writing it. And then when I redid it, okay, I was retired, but it was material that I identified with very personally. So the thing was with the first book also, what I was trying to do was trying to keep it very simple. I don't want to say I dumbed it down, but I understand that this book is going to athletes that might be reading in a bus. They might be reading on a plane. They might be, we don't have a whole lot of, I didn't want to make it too flowery or anything like that, because I knew that these athletes will have a limited amount of time. They will read one chapter and then they'll put it down for a while. So I didn't want to make it too complex. With my second book, what I'm writing now, I'm finding a little bit of writer's block, only because, without giving out too much information, I'm writing stories from others in first person. So there are also a lot of people that I don't know. Some of the people that I've interviewed, I know. Some of the people I've interviewed, I had no contact with before I asked them for an interview. So in that sense, writing for other people, in a way, that's become my challenge, and I really have to really set aside this time, like you guys said, and I've got a family as well, so it's not like I can just go in my man cave and then start writing at any time. So I've got to really set aside those times. But then there's pressure. Then you feel a little bit of pressure when you set aside that time. When I found that when I can write, when I can just do what I want and write without the time restraints or anything like that, then it flows much easier.
I think, Sean, you hit on something that I wanted to talk about in terms of that relevance. And I always worried about relevance in terms of, are these stories going to be too outdated? Am I going to write something and in 3 years, is overseas basketball going to look completely different? Is everything going to change? And I always wondered, I was very like social media wise, I'm like, I need to get on social media. I need to hit this. I need to sell this. I need to sell this. It's not going to be relevant. It's going to be stupid. And when you kind of look back and realize, like, it's always going to be relevant. The stories are always going to be there. And that was my biggest fear, is we're living in a world where like we said, everyone's time spent, you're just like, and then you're gone. And that was my biggest fear as a writer, to be like, are people going to be like, this is no longer relevant, done. This book was good for a year and now we're moving on. And I think that was my biggest fear, that I feel like we as writers put these ridiculous fears into our heads, because as athletes, we're always like, we're trying to strive to be the best. We want to be the best. And then when you're in a new field, you're just taking that, and sometimes it gets jumbled because you don't understand the system well enough. And I think that's the thing that I'm struggling with, is understanding the system and understanding how writing is going to be something that's going to last for a long period of time.
Right. I think that's a really good point. I think, especially as athletes, we're perfectionists to an extent. But here's the thing that I realized in the 14, 15 years that I had put my book to the side. Once I started writing it again and I started updating it and doing interviews and really doing more research, I realized that from 1999 when or let's say 2000 when I first started writing, to 2020, not a whole lot changed. There's some minor issues, but things like contracts stay the same. The things that guys worry about stay the same. Homesickness stay the same. Guys getting gypped for money stays the same. A lot of the funny stories were still happening today that I talked to guys that are currently still playing, and a lot of these stories were still relevant. And that's why, I mean, I've read your book as well, and your book will be something that will help someone later, just like mine will, and just like Paul's will. Paul, I have to say, actually, I read your book, I think in 2000, it came out in 2008. I think I read it in 2009 after I'd seen it on in Sports Illustrated or something like that. And that's when I was like, yo, this guy is doing it, I can do it too. And I had already started writing by then, but it was on the back burner by then. But I thought eventually I would write it. And I remember thinking after I read your book, like, there's so many parallels that I have to do my book at some point.
Yeah. Well, that's very heartening to hear. One thing that I've come to, and I think you both can probably appreciate this. My first book was, as I mentioned, kind of a big book, right? Like it was I got an advance, and it was a Random House book, and I was on ESPN and NPR and stuff like that. And it was fun and exciting, but I was back home 2 weekends ago for my 25th high school reunion in my tiny little shitty town of Meriden, Kansas. And I went to the homecoming football game on Friday night. And this guy that went to school with one of my brothers was standing there. I was chatting with him, trying to kind of figure out who he was, honestly, because I didn't go to high school with him specifically. And then he said, or his son came over. His son's probably 9. And his son was acting really shy and kind of odd. And I was like, hey, man, what's your name? And he told me. And then the guy, the old friend, was like, so my son read your novel, Ball Boy.
Wow.
And he was floored by it, because it's kind of the perfect story for a 9-year-old in Meriden, Kansas, which is part of why I wrote it. You know, I wanted to write something that I could have related to when I was that age. And so he then, you know, he got a little less shy as I bent down to talk to him. And it was so motivating to know that I had some impact, not necessarily profound, but substantial, on this one 9-year-old kid. That was much more interesting than getting to go on ESPN and talk about it, right? That personal connection. So I've really come around to this idea that, like, if you can get 10 people to go all the way through your book, do you know how much of a win that is? Because people don't read as much as we would like, of course. If you think about how much each of us reads, we may, in a great year, we maybe read 40 or 50 books, right? And the fact that you were able to spend that much time with one person is such a compliment to them. So, hearing you say that is really heartening to me. Because I would much rather have just one person connects to it deeply, as opposed to 20 people are like, oh yeah, it was okay. You know, like I think as writers, we want that one-on-one impact.
Yeah.
I think the monetizing a book, we'll get into that. But like you just said, I think that was one of the biggest things. I knew going into writing the book that it wasn't going to be this moneymaker. It's not going to be this thing where I can quit my day job and just be, live off the royalties of this one book. I knew that wasn't the case. So I started kind of thinking about, you know what, I just want as many people as possible to read this story. And I think that was your story just there resonates, because I would talk to people, and you always get those people, the friends and stuff, especially with social media like it is. I had a friend that I was really close with in 8th grade wrote me last night. said he read it, doesn't read it in 2 days and loved it, and was just like, what he said was exactly what I was trying to get across. Like what he talked about in the book, or about the book being, was exactly what I was trying, my goal of the book. And I thought that was the greatest compliment in the world I could get. It doesn't matter if I never sell another book. Those little times when people are like, I really enjoyed this. That's why, I mean, people, Shakespeare, like all of these famous writers, they weren't making money from books. They were writing to get their stories out. And I think that's kind of that, going back to that attitude has been so humbling and fun for me, because it allowed me to start saying, you know what, I just want people to enjoy it. And I think that's a huge thing mentally, as opposed to trying to monetize and be like, how can I make the most money possible off this right now?
Yeah,
Exactly.
But at the same time, let's get into monetizing. So all I was thinking the entire time, Paul, you're talking about, Ball Boy and having a book for young readers. Now I'm a language arts teacher right now, and I teach middle school language arts. And the one thing that I always say as I pick up books and I'm teaching this book is like, shit, if I wrote a book that this school district would buy 8,000 copies of, and then this school district would be like, I would never have to work again if I just came up with a book. I know we, 6th grade, 7th grade, we read the book The Crossover by Kwame Alexander, which is, he did a really interesting thing where he wrote this book and put it in verse. And it's very interesting. It's very good. A lot of my kids, it's their favorite book that they read. And every single time I read it, that's the first thing I think of, is like, was this so hard? Like, was this so hard to do? This could be the big ticket monetization, creating money. So how does that kind of play in when you guys are moving on with your writing careers? Is it the same thing? Are you looking for a way to make this book be, obviously your story out there, but obviously the most financial gain as possible?
I tend to look at it like an investment, like you would a stock, in that it's a, maybe the better way to put it is, it's a speculative investment. You're taking a bit of a risk on a dicey stock, in that you just cannot control people's taste. And that's okay, right? That, like, there's nothing wrong with their taste. There's nothing necessarily right with their taste. It's just going to change with the winds. I have a friend, Justin Halpern, who wrote a book called Shit My Dad Says, that you guys maybe are familiar with. It was a Twitter feed, and I think it has sold 3 million copies, right? And there's a world where Justin's book only sold 60,000 copies, right? It just happened to capture the zeitgeist at the moment. And I don't think we can control that. So looking at it first and foremost, like I said, as something that you're passionate about, something that you want 5 or 10 people to get through, that you want a high school friend to send you a message about, and that if by some miracle it captures people's imagination, then that's just a boon to you. With all that said, this is a very different attitude than I had when I was 32, when I thought everybody should read my stuff because I'm a genius. And I think that humbling that we go through as writers is really valuable to get to this place, whether it's as writers or as basketball players, right? Like, if we had spent our entire career thinking that the only reason we were playing was because someday we'll get paid, it would not have lasted, right? The only way it worked was because we fell in love with the feeling of being out on, for me, that gravel driveway when I was a kid, and just being alone with my thoughts and my jump shot. And that's what sustained me, and then led to, again, kind of a lottery ticket situation where I couldn't really control the fact that I grew, that I was coordinated, that all these things went right. All I could control was the fact that I loved it along the way.
I will tell you guys, my mother used to tell me, you get married the first time for love, you get married the second time for money. This book, I'm never going to make money off this book. My first book, I'm never going to make money off this book. This was a thing of love. This was a thing to help athletes. This was a thing to make sure that the next generation doesn't fall for the same things that I've heard or I've experienced or I know about. This was a labor of love. It was, I'm self-publishing. It's not that I have a publishing house behind me. I'm doing all the PR for it by myself, Instagram, everything. I'm doing it all by myself when I have time, when I can do it. When if I can't, I can't, you know? So this is definitely a labor of love. My second book, however, is also going to be it's also going to be a labor of love. No, I'm putting out, I have an idea for, let's say, 2 more books, and I'm doing it in order to give people a view of life over here that not many people have or have experienced, or at least not willing to speak about. People think we make a whole lot of money over here, and some guys are, but most of us aren't. And that's kind of the voice that I want to be for the guys that aren't making the 100,000 a year or upwards. And for me, that's the whole reason behind it. I'm also a teacher. I love my job. I'm not giving up my job ever. I would like to do some public speaking at one point and go to colleges and talk about things like the first book, but that's all in the future. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So for me, I'll probably self-publish all my books, and I have no problem with that. And I've given out probably more books than I've sold, just because I just want people to have the information. That's the most important thing. And it's like what you said, Paul. We started playing a game because we loved the game, and the monetary stuff came later. If at some point some publishing house would like to work with me or groom me or whatever, I would be open to that. But for me, the it's like you said, the being on your driveway, that's what I'm doing this for.
Mm.
When you guys were writing your book, were there any stories that you wish you had included or that you wish had not got taken out?
John, it feels like that resonated with you. I'll let you go first.
I'm going to give you a scoop. In my book, I talk about something about a player that did something. I'm not going to say exactly what it is. If you read the book, you'll probably understand what I mean. But in my book, there's something about a player doing something. That player was me. I didn't identify the player.
Nice.
It's a great story. It's a great story. And that player was me. But no, I don't regret anything that I've put in there or think that I should have worked something in or anything like that. I think how it came out was perfect.
I think with my first book and some of my online writing, I felt pressure to be funny that then led to me not trusting that the story was good enough on its own. And so any regrets that I would have to do with trying to pile one joke on top of another joke, or thinking that I needed to live up to people's expectations about being humorous. That was one of the fun things about writing Stories I Tell on Dates, which I think is a better book, but it doesn't have the same hook that the first one did. The first one has, this guy played in the NBA. Like, that's an easy sell. The second one was, this guy's had a weird life and here are some funny stories. I think I did a little better job of just letting the stories breathe and having confidence that they were worthwhile, even if they weren't like knee-slappingly hilarious.
Yeah, there's some stories that pop into my mind here and there that I'm like, oh, I didn't really get into that, or aspects of overseas basketball that I didn't really talk about. I talked a little bit about, the loneliness. But it was like, skipped over kind of quick because, Paul, I think, what you said, you wanted the book. I wanted the book to be funny. So I didn't want to throw too much stuff in there where people are like, oh, this isn't funny anymore. Like, why am I reading this? He's all sad. Like, I don't want to read the funny guy being sad. So I kind of just skipped over, but there's a lot of stuff in there that dealt with that loneliness that I kind of just was like, nah. And then there were some funny stories that I was like, shit. Like, after I published it, I was like, that would have been a good story for here, but whatever. There's always time for more.
Kevin and Sean, you can probably speak to this too. I think one of the fights I always had was, and people said this about my first book in sometimes vitriolic ways, sometimes people struggle to understand that even though our lives looked from the outside like the dream life to them, that we were still fighting the same struggles with loneliness or insecurity or being unsure of our place in the world that anyone else was facing. And so I also felt like sometimes, especially with the basketball related stuff, it was hard to admit to things being not how I'd envisioned them, because I would get this blowback of like, well, you should be grateful. And you're like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I know, but I should also just be grateful that I have all my limbs and that my health is good. Like, we could all come up with a zillion things we should be grateful for, but like in the existential moment of trying to figure out, like, do I keep playing basketball or do I stop? None of that really helps, right? It's like when somebody, if you were to, I don't know, break a leg and they're like, well, at least you're not paralyzed. And you're like, well, yeah, I guess, but like, could you just say sorry about your broken leg? Because that sucks, you know? And so like when I would be like, God, you know, it's tough that I'm so lonely and I've not had a real girlfriend in 4 years. Then they're like, well, but you get to play professional basketball. And you're like, I do, but like there's other things to life, you know?
It is. There's that, oh, boo-hoo, you had this life. What are you complaining about? You should never be sad.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just, you know, there's so much jealousy, but I think that's just the lack of understanding. And I think that's what our three books really do, is it kind of shows you that human side of basketball. And it's not just, we're just these mental Kobe's that would just go out every single day and win everything and then sleep with 10,000 women. And then you're just like, life is just great and people are feeding you grapes. Right. It's like completely not that. And I think that's why it's so unique. When they read, it's this, and I feel like those are the kind of people who say those things are the people who really didn't read the book. They just look and they're like, look at the back cover and they're like, oh, it's a struggle, huh? Like, well, my life's a struggle at like working at 7-Eleven. You're like, that's not my fault. Like, just read the book. And I think that's one of those things where people just get real mad. I don't know, Sean, like you can speak on this as well, because I think that's something that, especially in your book, like you're giving this guide to God. Did you ever have to deal with like that criticism?
Yeah, I mean, I think not so much the criticism, but people are really surprised when they read my book, from the feedback that I've been getting. People are really surprised at some of the stories and some of the things that I explain about that they had no idea about. For example, there's no manual to prepare you for a lot of the mental stuff that you have to deal with as a foreigner over here in Europe. And I'll give you a really quick story. When I won my first championship, I was playing against my former team. So there was a huge dose of adrenaline going on inside of me. I ended up making the last basket to win the championship in the series and won. So as I make the basket and I turn, we're at our place, and I turn to the crowd, and I'm going nuts and I'm excited. And I look in the stands, and sometimes you just catch one person. I look in the stands, and it's my former assistant coach's wife. Now, mind you, I had eaten at their place. I knew their daughters. I had played there for 4 years, so we were tight. The wife of my former assistant coach is in the stands doing this. At that moment, I picked it up, but I was also in my own world, and I knew we were about to win. But afterwards, I was like, "Oh, that's some fucked up shit." I ate at that lady's place, you know, and that's a story that's indicative of what we go over, what we experience out here in this lifestyle that no one can prepare you for. You know, no one can criticize you for things like that because they haven't experienced them themselves. And I think what I'm getting is a lot of surprise, like, wow, it's a totally different world. And that's why I named it same name, different game, because it's a totally different thing to playing overseas as compared to an American lifestyle or an NBA lifestyle. It's a totally different thing that you cannot even fathom unless you've actually been here.
It is wild, the amount of non-understanding of what goes on with an athlete. Like you said, you're only as good. People don't realize that you are, and this is going to sound really, it might come off wrong, but you're almost being used as an athlete. Like, you're only as good as you're able to produce. And then once you're done producing, especially overseas, you know, there's other places where you can continue and be a success, and be that guy who comes back to games and is loved, like a Philadelphia Allen Iverson, still loved every time he comes back. But when you're overseas, it's like you're gone and forgotten about, and no one cares. And that's where, like, that you think you have that loyalty to the fan base. And even reaching out and doing this book, I'm reaching out to teams, and they're like not responding. I was like, but I played for you, and like no response. So this mindset that like this, hey, they're definitely gonna be on board. I played for them, and they're like not even responding to my emails. I'm like, oh shit, this is not what I thought it was going to be. But like you said, you're only as good to those people as you are when you're playing for them and earning them something, and then you're just kind of like thrown away like anything else in life, which sucks.
Yeah.
It's a very, you feel like a commodity, especially as you mentioned, Kevin, after the fact. We forget, I go through this with my alma mater a fair bit, where I'm like, seems like you guys should be more interested in some of these things that I'm doing. And you forget, like, oh, well, they've had, hundreds of college basketball players, and they've got their own things to worry about. And it's also a monolithic company that doesn't really care.
It's so funny. Yeah, like I thought the same thing. I'm like, hey, Monmouth, you should be interested in the things that I'm doing. Like, now this is pretty cool.
Right.
And I remember last year, well, now, Monmouth has really reached out. They're like, come up to a game, come up and talk to the kids, which I think is super cool. But I remember like 2 years ago, I'd retired. I was just no one. I was just a guy who played there. And I wrote the athletic director, and I was like, hey, I'm coming up to the game. He's like, cool, I'll get you tickets. And then I kind of went down and like talked to him for a little bit, and I was like, who do I like? He was like making fun of me because I had a Penn shirt on because I didn't have any college gear, and my brother went to Penn, so I was just wearing a Penn shirt because he got all kinds of gear. And they're like, oh, and then that was the end of the conversation, and I was like, yeah, I need some Monmouth gear, and they're like, yeah, definitely. And then I walked away and never got Monmouth gear, and it was one of those things where I was just like, what the hell, guys? Like, just a sweatshirt, something. Like, they have tall clothes. Like, I can't go to the store and buy something. It's not going to fit me. I need something from the basketball team. I thought it was wild.
Yeah.
I've got to say, I've been extremely fortunate with Southern Utah that they really supported what I'm doing. And I mean, I've got gear from them. I've got other stuff. They've supported me with the book as well. And I'm lucky in that aspect. I guess it's because I'm a Hall of Famer, so my name still carries a small bit of weight there, maybe. But it's funny. It's like that. And in European basketball, anyway, once you're gone, you're gone. And I write about it in the book. There's the contract situation. It's not like in the NBA where you're there for, you're going to be there for 4, 5, 6 years. Your kids grow up there. You're stable there. Okay, you can be traded at a moment's notice, but you kind of, it's the part of the business, right? But of course, in Europe, you're on 1-year deals. Maybe if you're lucky, you're on a 1+1 deal where the team holds the option for the second year. So there's that sense of you are a soldier, you coming to work, you're doing your job. If we want you, fine, let's re-sign you, or you can test the market. But if we don't want you, bye, ciao, see you later. And I've also reached out to some teams that I've played for. And I gotta say that I'm pretty lucky, maybe especially because I'm still in Europe, that I've had some pretty good responses back. But it's really like that. And I feel bad for a lot of guys that have come over here and have been just really screwed over, because it happens a lot.
Well, it's funny because I feel bad now that I felt like I dogged Monmouth. I feel like I dogged Monmouth a little bit. So I just, because they did reach out and they're like, whatever you need, we're having a whole thing for you. I was like, all right, cool. So when they read this, they're going to be like, all right, delete that shit. Like, we're not done out of that. But guys, this is honestly, we've been doing this podcast for a while. I did podcasts before, and this is by far the one I've loved the most, because you guys are not only peers in basketball, but as the writing community, you're peers, but you're also people I look up to. And that's why it was so much fun to have you guys on the show, because I look up to you guys. I look up and I want to, have your success. I want to write like you write. I want to do it like you do. So this is really humbling and really cool for me. So I can't thank you guys both enough for coming on and giving us your time and discussing the process of writing a book and being an athlete. It's been super cool.
Thank you for saying that. It's as we keep saying, I think the one thing that I continue to learn about writing is that the joy comes from those one-on-one connections. So that's very lovely to hear.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's definitely the mutual respect that comes from knowing that we've all been through very similar roads and paths, and also as a writer and things like that. And I appreciate the kind words and the opportunity to be here and talk and meet you guys. It's for sure the best podcast I've done so far as well.
Well, I appreciate you guys, and thank you so much for joining us. Paul, Shirley, Sean McCaw, great job. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon, and good luck with everything you're doing in the writing world. I love it.
Thanks, Kevin. See you soon.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye. Awesome stuff, Matt. That was really good.
Yeah, it was good. That was good. That was really, really good. A lot of good content in that.
I liked it too. I thought it was really good.
It's so much fun. Well, this is the Overseas Famous podcast. We will see you guys next time. Have a great day. Have a great week. We'll see you soon.